Hello, and welcome to Maybe I Can, exploring possibilities one sprinkle at a time. If you've ever found yourself asking, is this all there is to life? Then you're in the right place. I'm Debbie, author, speaker, entrepreneur, and coach. And every Tuesday, I'm here to share a sprinkle of hope and inspiration. Together, we'll uncover the more joy, more fulfillment, more prosperity, more fun. We'll share stories of transformation, actionable tips, and that little nudge you need to take the next step. So let's embark on this journey of discovery and say, maybe I can, to a life filled with more. Ready to find out? Let's get started. The Maybe I Can show starts now. Well, hello there. And welcome to the Maybe I Can podcast. I'm your host, Debbie Weiss, and thank you so much for tuning in. And, just thinking about what we're going to talk about today, which is grief, doesn't really fit in maybe with the Maybe I Can model, so to speak. But, maybe I can learn to live with my grief. Maybe I can live a life that I never envisioned for myself without the loss of a loved one. So, yeah, it fits in because unfortunately, grief is a universal emotion and something that typically all of us will have to deal with at one time or another. I think we just hope that we're a little older than younger when grief first happens. So what specifically are we going to talk about today? We're going to talk about the stages of grief, how grief can differ based on the relationship we have to the person that we lost, and talk a little bit about anticipatory grief. And I'll define that a little bit later. Before I get started, I think I do this every week. I got to apologize. I feel like I don't have a lot of power behind my voice and my throat. I never thought I would say it. I'm tired of talking because today I had my first session recording my audiobook for my next book, The Sprinkle Effect, A Guide to Living a More Colorful and Fulfilling Life. And I think I just recorded for about 4.5 hours straight. And boy, it really does take a toll on your voice, on your brain. Even though I wrote the words, it doesn't matter. You're still reading and processing and figuring out, how do I say this sentence? I don't know. I don't know what I was thinking about scheduling the recording of the audiobook for the same day that I jump on here and do the podcast. And FYI, I realized today I did the same thing next Tuesday. So whatever, but the difficulties, right? Oh, please, what was me? Just saying. So I feel like I might not feel as strong. So at least you know why. Okay, so let's get started talking about grief. I think the grief we're going to talk about today is really about losing someone, but grief can also come in different forms, right? It could be the grieving a life that you thought you'd have. Maybe you wanted to be an Olympic athlete since the Olympics just ended. It's on my mind. And you don't make it and you realize you're too old and this was your last chance and you're grieving that kind of life. Something like that. Grief doesn't just have to do with the loss of a loved one, but that is what we're going to focus on today. So let's start with, what are the stages of grief? And these are stages that were written about in Elizabeth Kubler-Ross's 5 stages of grief. It's a particular model. Now, this doesn't mean that if you're grieving, that you experience every single one, or that you're going to experience them in the order that they're mentioned, that you're not going to experience other things, right? It's just a general guideline. And there are 5 different stages that she talks about: denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. And you know what? You could jump from one to the other and back and forth. Gosh, it is just such a ever-changing process, right? And it does vary greatly. But today we're going to try and pigeonhole it a little bit just to give it a bit of a framework. So the first stage of grief is denial. And, you know, denial is like this defense mechanism. It's the initial shock. And, you know, I have to say that I don't want to say I've had a loved one, you know, die suddenly from an unexpected accident or something like that. So I don't know what that feels like, that type of shock. But I think back to when my dad died. I knew he was dying, but he died at 4:00 in the morning in a nursing home. My brother and I were both there. He took his last breath. We were in the room. We cried. We hugged each other. And then the nurse said, I need you to get on the phone and give the nursing home personnel instructions. Who's picking him up? Where are they taking him? And I was like, what? What is happening? My father just died? And it was like almost this disbelief. And then I had to call my aunt, my father's sister, and tell her. And it was almost like this out-of-body experience, like somebody else was doing all of these things, not me. I don't know if it felt like it must be a mistake or this can't be happening, but I think I was kind of in denial. It was just like, okay, you know, oh, my father died. All right, well, here's what I'm supposed to do. And this might sound like a terrible story, but when my father moved into the nursing home, they didn't have a TV for him in his room. I don't know why. And it was like, I don't know why they couldn't find us one. And we said, okay, we're going to bring in our own TV. But we were like really adamant that they knew that this was our TV so that when the time came, we were going to take it out. And there my brother and I sat, my father still honestly laying in the bed, no longer breathing. And they told us, okay, you know, you'll come back in a day or two and collect all his belongings. Again, feeling surreal. And is this really happening? And my brother and I looked at each other and we looked at the TV. And at 4:30 a.m., we walked out of the nursing home with my father just passing away 20 minutes earlier, carrying this damn TV. And, you know, my brother and I just laughed. I mean, I think it was just this comical, emotional release. And the funny thing is, that TV sat in my basement. Nobody ever used it until about a year ago when I finally cleaned out my basement. At that point, the TV was like, I don't know, 20-something years old, didn't even work. But we were so worried about that TV. And I think it was a way of almost blocking out what had just happened. Denial, we just can't process the news, and that whole denial defense mechanism thing kind of helps us. The next stage is anger. Why did this happen? It's not fair. How come me? How come them? You know, you just get so angry and frustrated, and this feeling of helplessness. And I think that it is such a natural response, right? Because you're looking around at the rest of the world. Gosh, I'm going to keep using my father as an example. I remember going back to work 5 days later and being so angry at the things that other people were thinking about and talking about, trivial things. When I was so angry, I was angry that he was gone. I was angry for the life that he had, how difficult it was because he was ill for 30 years. And it was just, it was tough, but I don't know. I guess anger well, now I know that it's a natural phase and I didn't know it. And Elizabeth says in her model that it can serve as a bridge to more profound emotions that the person might be denying. Next, we jump into bargaining. This could be you're bargaining with a higher power, with yourself, with fate. It could be, if only I didn't, if only I had. What if this had happened? Then this would have never happened. I could have done things differently. Or, bargaining with a higher power of, oh, please, don't let X happen. I'll never do whatever again. It's trying to regain control of what's going on in your life, where you're feeling when someone you love, when you lose someone you love, everything's spinning out of control. And we'll talk in a little bit how that will vary based on the relationship of the person that you lost. But no matter what, there is always some form of feeling out of control. And you just want to be able to get your life back, get back in control, because how did this happen? And you just want to make that feeling go away. And I think that you're trying not really to cope with the pain. Because when you get to the next step, the next stage, which is depression, that's when you are beginning to cope with the pain. And depression is marked by such deep sadness, and it could be withdrawal, right? It could be withdrawal from other people, withdrawal from life. And as we know, or I think we mostly know by now, is that depression can take on various levels of intensity. And if it gets extreme, then we do need to seek professional help. But if it's a stage where it's that overwhelming sense of sorrow and wondering, how can I possibly go on without them? And life no longer has any meaning. You know what? Those are necessary steps that we need to work through, either ourselves or with a therapist. I feel like we need to go through that. This is a stage, to me, this is my own opinion. You have to go through that, right? Because this is the place where you really are feeling the whole emotion, the whole pain of what you've lost, who you've lost, how your life will now be different. And all the other stages, maybe you needed to go through those, maybe you didn't, but they're kind of all leading up to the fact that you got to finally deal with it. Because if you don't, and you don't get through this stage at the time of the loss, I can guarantee you that at some point in your future, it's going to rear its quote unquote ugly head and come back to bite you. And lastly, stage number 5 is acceptance. we get to the point where we realize it happened. I'm not okay with it, but I really have no choice but accept it and realize, and now I have to figure out how to live like this. You know, I pause because I can go on and talk about my personal situations of how difficult that is. And I can remember really, I'm going to my father because I'm going to talk more about my husband next segment. But with my father, I was his caregiver for 30 years. He didn't live with me, but I was still his caregiver. And boy, I used to get so irritated and felt so burdened at the time and all the things. And back then there were no cell phones, and he would call my house incessantly and for the smallest things, time and time again. I remember sitting there and Gary, my husband, and I being like, he's never going to call again. And I don't have to plan my life around going to visit him, going to the nursing home or wherever he was living over those past 30 years. It was only a nursing home for the last few. And I don't have to worry about driving him to doctor's appointments and all the things. And even though in some way it was a relief, it significantly did change my life. And maybe I could say for the better, but not really, because the minute he was gone, I wanted all those responsibilities back. That's acceptance. I did accept it. My life was changing, and now, I had some extra time to fill, honestly, without him in my life, and I did have to reshape it. All right, now let's talk about who you lose. And obviously, there's a plethora of relationships, of people that we could lose. But I just really want to focus on your spouse, your parent, or your child. Other than my father, thank goodness my mom is still alive. And thank goodness I cannot speak personally about the loss of a child. The only one that I can speak about is the loss of a spouse, because if you've been listening, you know that I lost my husband, Gary, to terminal cancer on December 30th, 2022. So at the time of this, I guess I'm moving closer. I'm a little past 18 months living without him. And it is after losing my dad and then my husband, I can say that they're very, very different experiences. And of course, for everyone here, again, this would be different based on the relationship that you had with your spouse, with your parent. It's not going to be the same for everyone. But losing a spouse for me, it was a heck of, and it still is a heck of a lot more difficult, because even though my dad was a part of my everyday life, he was not my life partner. He was not the father of my children. He was not the person that I had this 30 years of being my partner in everything. I mean, everything. He and I even worked together, for 25 years leading up to it. I was part of a couple for 30 years. And all of a sudden I wasn't. All of a sudden I was my children's only parent. All of a sudden I had to figure out, what the heck do I do when, water's leaking through my roof and I don't have him to ask or guide me? And what do I do, making some major life decisions alone? I thought I would forever be part of a team. I loved being part of a team. And look, our marriage was very far from perfect. And the last decade, it was almost like I didn't have a partner, but he was alive. And to a certain extent, I still did have a partner, maybe not the partner that I wanted, but he was still there. And, depending upon your role in the marriage, right? Maybe all of a sudden you never dealt with the finances. You're all, or you have young children. I guess luckily my children were I don't know. Now I'm thinking about it, 20 and 22 or 20 and 21, whatever they were at the time. So even though, they weren't old, they were older. And that affected my daily life, where sometimes when you lose a parent, it's not the same. When you lose a parent, now you've lost kind of your mentor relationship, somebody that you've, again, typically, depending upon your relationship, often have gone to for guidance or wisdom or support. I remember when my dad died, it was like no man, not my husband, because it's different, right? And when you're a parent, will ever love me as much as my father did. Ever. There's no one who will look at me in the same way that he did and support me in those kind of ways. And it's like I said, luckily I'm very grateful that my mom is alive. But when you lose both parents, now it's that feeling, and I get it. You're thinking, oh boy, I'm next, right? It really makes you think about your own mortality. That generation is gone, and now you see yourself getting older. It's you can feel lost and alone because you just don't feel like you have that same support system and sense of love. And I take a sigh because the loss of a child, those of you who've had to live through such a horrific thing, I can't imagine. My mother actually was just telling me today on the phone that she couldn't believe how many of her friends had actually lost a child. And those intense feelings, maybe they blame themselves depending upon how the child died. You're also losing those future dreams for your children, things that you'll never possibly experience depending on the situation. You'll never be a grandparent. You'll never live to see their wedding or their graduation, or then you have to deal with the siblings and how the whole family dynamic changes, and just that feeling of isolation. And I know how it feels when other people have spouses and they're complaining about their spouses. And I'm thinking, well, at least you have a spouse to complain about. I can't even imagine. I just can't. When you lose a child, it's just truly, to me, the most unimaginable relationship to lose. And with time running out, let me just turn to anticipatory grief. That is typically when someone is facing a terminal illness or a long-term decline in health, like Alzheimer's disease. And you know what the outcome is. You don't know when, but slowly you're losing that person. They're alive, but you're losing them. They might physically be alive, but maybe you're mentally losing them. And it's just this mixing of so many different feelings. How do you grieve someone when they're still alive, and then you're grieving them, but then yet all of a sudden they might have moments and it seems like they're their old selves and there's possibly hope. And you feel so guilty because you could resent them, or you can get frustrated and angry with them. And I can feel this way about my dad and about my husband. You know, in hindsight, of course, I look back, why didn't I have more patience? And I feel so guilty about sometimes how I behaved. You know, dealing with this type of grief, especially if you're dealing with it for a long time, and as a almost lifelong caregiver, I know what this feels like, and it's a perfect time for someone who's dealing with this type of grief to seek support, whether through a therapist, whether it's through a support group with other family members who are dealing with a terminal illness, or Alzheimer's disease, or mental illness, or Parkinson's, whatever it might be, because it's so helpful to be with other people who just get it. And it's that feeling when they actually die of this guilt of them, of you don't want them to die, but you want them to die because you don't want to see them suffer. But yet then they die and you think, oh my gosh, I wish this to happen and I didn't want it to happen. It is just such a combination of different emotions that can really eat you alive. And so from personal experience, dealing with this type of situation, all therapy can always be of help, but this anticipatory grief, this long-term thing, therapy, support groups can absolutely help. As our time is coming to a close, and I keep pausing because, gosh, it seems like in 30 minutes, there's no way to talk about the importance of grief. And, in future episodes, we'll dive a little deeper, have some guests that maybe have some experience, because it's such an important topic. And it's something that, like I said, we all have to deal with. But how do I end this? How do I end this on an upbeat note? Well, I guess I can say, maybe I can, and maybe you can. Not maybe, it's difficult. We all will deal with grief at some point in our lives. And even though we have to go through all the stages, or as many stages, and all the different relationships, we've got each other's back. That's what we're here for. And that's what I'm always here for. So please reach out. Any questions, any support, I'm always here. DM me on Instagram, debbie.r.weiss, or email me, debbie@debbierweiss.com. Okay, guys, hang in there. Put a smile on your face, because maybe you can. And I'll see you next week. Thanks for spending part of your day with me here on Maybe I Can, exploring possibilities one sprinkle at a time. It's been great having you, and I hope you're leaving with a spark to light up your journey to more. Remember, every big change starts with a single maybe. If you're ready to kickstart that change but not sure where to begin, I've got just the thing for you. Head over to download my free guide, The One Critical Step to Kickstart Change, and take that all-important first step. Let's make those maybes into reality, one sprinkle at a time. Catch you next Tuesday at 4 p.m. Eastern, 1 p.m. Pacific, with more stories, tips, and that extra push you might need. I'm Debbie saying goodbye for now, but always remember, maybe, just maybe, you can.